Tom Cameron's crazy.
Ed Huntley. David Brinkley. John Chen.
Tom Brokaw.
Deep cuts. General Motors planning to cut tens of thousands of blue-collar jobs. Can these massive cuts get the world's biggest automaker back on track? Breaking silence. He was a secret informant for the FBI who helped track down a most wanted criminal. So why didn't the federal government deliver on its promise to him? An NBC News exclusive. The pill, the contraceptive that changed society. Millions of American women have taken it, so why won't this pharmacist fill a prescription? And the new kindergarten. Recess, nap time, snack time, things of the past. These days, the pressure is on. It's not easy being 5.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. At one time, it was so big. As the largest and most profitable company in America, it represented 3% of the entire U.S. economy. Of course, that was back when people only bought American cars. Today, General Motors is not what it once was, and in an effort to get better, GM today announced a slashing of its workforce and a retooling of the company. They say a new chapter begins tonight, and we begin here tonight with NBC's Anne Thompson.
In an ornate Delaware ballroom, CEO Rick Wagner laid out his vision for a stripped-down General Motors with fewer models and fewer people to improve the bottom line.
Let me say up front that our absolute top priority is to get our largest business unit back to profitability as soon as possible.
The unit, GM North America, which started the year losing more than $1 billion. The plan to cut 25,000 manufacturing jobs, 22% of its American blue-collar workforce, and close some assembly and parts plants by 2008, saving $2.5 billion.
We don't want to lay out the details today. Frankly, we want to make those calls when the time are right.
Workers in Detroit weren't impressed.
I think it's a crime. I think we're doing everything we can on those assembly lines to turn this company around.
Over $700 million.
And shareholders called for Wagner's resignation.
The Titanic sank because the directors ignored the warnings.
The cuts are part of a 4-point strategy to revive GM that includes spending nearly $1 billion on new products, streamlining 6 of its 8 brands to eliminate similar vehicles, and reducing healthcare costs that put it at a competitive disadvantage. Wagner is asking the United Auto Workers to share the burden.
We need to move promptly. I don't want to lay out an artificial deadline, create a frenzy from that.
Auto analyst Jim Hall says the plan is a good start, but by no means the finish line in a race with rising gas prices, increasing foreign competition, and the need for vehicles that capture the nation's attention.
This is actually GM coming to the realization that the game is a very different game from what it was just 5 years ago.
So much so, one GM executive says the company may need to relearn it's not in the transportation business, but in arts and entertainment, pursuing that emotional customer response to accelerate its return to money-making. Ann Thompson, NBC News, Wilmington.
And on Capitol Hill today, a hearing on a growing problem in this country, underfunded pension plans. Congress itself loosened pension reporting rules several years back, and corporate America took advantage. Now there's an alarming number of underfunded plans, starting with the airlines. Here with that, NBC's Chip Reed.
When United Airlines defaulted on its employee pension plan last month, the burden of paying pensions fell to the federal government, which is expected to provide only a fraction of what United's employees had been promised. Today, a Senate committee heard the anger behind the statistics.
Their only mistake was one of trust. They trusted the retirement promises that United made for decades.
And it's not just United. Airline executives and union representatives today warned that other major airlines might also soon declare bankruptcy and dump their pension plans, what some call the domino effect.
I can tell you with absolute certainty, Delta Airlines, Continental Airlines, Northwest Airlines, and eventually American Airlines are on that same path.
At times today, the frustration spilled over.
I'm going to say, you're going to listen.
Senator Jim Bunning dressing down Delta's boss on behalf of Kentucky's 8,000 Delta employees.
And their livelihood depends on whether you survive or whether you don't survive.
And the worrying doesn't end with the airlines. A recent report by the Government Accountability Office says more than half of the nation's 100 largest pension funds were underfunded. That's important because the federal agency that insures pension plans already has a $23 billion deficit because of defaults, raising fears of an economic crisis along the lines of the savings and loan debacle of the 1980s.
It's highly likely that you would be faced with a possible taxpayer bailout unless fundamental and dramatic reform is enacted sooner rather than later.
Senator Chuck Grassley says it's up to Congress to tighten the rules.
The bottom line is we need to put this in shape so that there's complete transparency for the workers.
Workers who wonder if pension plans they've counted on for years will be there when they need them. Chip Reed, NBC News, Washington.
On Wall Street today, stocks ended the day mixed after pulling back from big gains early in this day. The Dow finished up 16 points. NASDAQ was down almost 9. In Washington today, President Bush and Tony Blair came face to face. The official agenda, help for developing nations in Africa. But afterwards, when they took questions from the press, the subject quickly turned to Iraq and a controversial memo about the invasion. NBC News Chief White House correspondent David Gregory with us tonight from the White House. David, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. You're right. Mr. Blair came to the White House facing more questions about the intelligence that led to war.
This was the first meeting between the British Prime Minister and President Bush since Mr. Blair narrowly won a third term last month. His support for the Iraq war cost his Labour Party in the polls. Today, the Prime Minister denied that the White House twisted intelligence about Iraq's weapons programs in a rush to war.
All the way through that period of time, we were trying to look for a way of managing to resolve this without conflict.
Mr. Blair was answering a charge from a 2002 memo summarizing a pre-war briefing given the Prime Minister by his intelligence chief. The so-called Downing Street memo, now a rallying cry for war critics, claims that in July 2002, the president had already decided to go to war and claims, quote, the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. In an interview for tomorrow's Today Show, Mr. Blair told Katie Couric the intelligence was used in, quote, good faith.
We knew there was post-September the 11th, we knew we had to take a different attitude to WMD. The place to start was Iraq. The thing to do was to enforce UN resolutions, and that's what we went out to do.
We worked hard to see if we could figure out how to do this peacefully. To put a united front up to Saddam Hussein, said the world speaks, and he ignored the world.
The major focus of today's meeting was hunger and poverty in Africa. The two leaders announced plans to eliminate all debt for reform-minded African governments, and the U.S. pledged nearly $700 million in immediate famine relief to countries in the Horn of Africa.
But Mr. Blair wanted much more in African aid and is now under pressure to get from the United States the kind of political support he provided during the Iraq War. Brian?
David Gregory at the White House for us tonight. Thanks. An intense standoff today on a major freeway in Los Angeles. The chase that started it all started this morning after a man posing as a delivery courier tried to kidnap a woman. She escaped. He took off, leading the California Highway Patrol on a chase that reached 70 miles an hour at times. After 3 hours of this, CHP nudged his van. It's a move they practice. That sent it spinning into a wall. Then they boxed the suspect in with vehicles. In the end, with the help of police dogs, emergency vehicles, tear gas, and rubber bullets, police managed to bring the man down. This all happened on the always busy Interstate 10. The 10, as they call it, stretches from the Pacific Ocean to Florida. Traffic at midday in L.A. was backed up for at least 10 miles. Those backups, by the way, went in both directions. Up next this Tuesday night, NBC News In Depth. The government wants help catching criminals and terrorists, but when one informant did help, his reward didn't come through as promised. Then later, whatever happened to graham crackers and a nap? As kindergarten gets more and more serious, more parents ask, whatever happened to being a kid? NBC News In Depth tonight, whistleblowers and what can happen to some of them after they report wrongdoing. Take, for example, a man named Tommy Hook, who was savagely beaten by a gang of men outside a strip club in Santa Fe because he says they wanted to silence him after he alleged billions of dollars in waste at the Los Alamos National Lab. Hook is scheduled to testify about his findings in Congress later this month. Law enforcement sources in Santa Fe, by the way, say the men involved in Hook's beating say it was just a bar fight. The investigation continues. Now to the way the government treats whistleblowers, those folks who take risks to try to help catch criminals and terrorists. The federal authorities promise rewards of as much as $25 million for the world's most wanted. But how easy is it to actually collect? One undercover informant who helped the FBI arrest one of their 10 most wanted international fugitives says in his case it was a nightmare. The secret informant has never told his story until now. NBC News senior investigative correspondent Lisa Myers has our exclusive story.
The plague is terrorism.
The message is simple. Turn in most wanted criminals, get a huge reward.
You may receive up to $5 million by contacting us.
But how simple is it really to collect big rewards from the U.S. government?
It was the worst process I ever faced in my life.
This man, we'll call him John, asked us to conceal his identity for fear of retribution. He worked undercover as a paid informant for the FBI for 2 years to help track down the anti-abortion extremist who murdered Dr. Barnett Slepian in 1998. The murderer, James Kopp, was placed on the FBI's most wanted list the same day as Osama bin Laden.
These individuals are to be considered extremely dangerous and armed.
John says an FBI agent promised a big reward if he helped the FBI capture Kopp.
He promised me that he will come down by airplane and he will carry a attaché with $1 million.
The FBI agent promised you $1 million
yes.
if you would help.
Yes.
And it was the money that was seductive.
Well, money, yes, was seductive. There's no question about it. I'd be lying.
John claims he was not told about the fine print until much later, that some of the $1 million reward would come from the FBI, some from the Justice Department, and some from Canada. He claims he was never told the Canadians would pay only if Kopp were convicted there. The FBI admits John did deliver, providing key information that led to Kopp's arrest, including this Western Union receipt that revealed Kopp's alias and where he was hiding in France. After Kopp's arrest in March 2001, the FBI immediately paid John $50,000. After Kopp pleaded guilty in 2003, John tried to collect the rest of his money, hounding federal officials, taping hundreds of hours of calls, writing Attorney General Ashcroft to complain the government was dragging its heels. He says he got no response. So you helped the FBI capture one of the 10 most wanted fugitives.
That's correct.
And you have to harass the Justice Department to get your reward money?
That's correct.
9 months after Kopp's conviction, the FBI paid John another $100,000. Last summer, days after John began talking to NBC News, and 15 months after the conviction, the Justice Department finally paid up $500,000. Why did it take so long? Senior U.S. law enforcement officials say the FBI misplaced key documents, and the Justice Department money got bogged down in red tape. But they argue John eventually was paid handsomely, $650,000. However, John claims he's still owed hundreds of thousands of dollars by Canada and cautions tipsters to get everything in writing.
Promise made by the government doesn't necessarily mean that they will deliver.
Canadian officials say as long as Kopp is in a U.S. prison and hasn't been convicted in Canada, John won't ever collect. Lisa Myers, NBC News, Washington.
Up next here as we continue, 4 decades after a Supreme Court decision paved the way for the widespread use of the birth control pill, its politics are still being debated. It was exactly 40 years ago today in a case called Griswold versus Connecticut that the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling that provided the first constitutional protection for birth control. It paved the way for widespread acceptance of contraception in America. Since that time, tens of millions of women have used the contraceptive pill. At last count in 2002, nearly 45 million women were using it or had once used it. But even today, some are being told no when they try to fill a prescription. Today, as NBC's Tom Costello reports, Congress stepped into this debate.
In Georgia, Michelle Havich says she was baffled when she went to get her prescription filled. The pharmacist leaned over the counter and just said no.
She just said since she did not believe in birth control pills,
she would not give them to me.
It's happened before. Pharmacists with deeply held beliefs refusing to fill prescriptions for contraceptives. Lloyd Duplantis, a pharmacist in Louisiana since 1969, is opposed to all contraception, birth control, and morning-after pills.
As a pharmacist, I'm here to protect life. I'm not here to destroy life.
But today on Capitol Hill, lawmakers called that outrageous and introduced legislation to guarantee that pharmacies fill any legal prescription.
It is beyond my comprehension that a woman today could go to a pharmacist with a prescription and not get the drug.
The right to choose is literally meaningless without the access to choose.
California, Nevada, New Jersey, and Missouri are already moving to ensure a woman's contraceptive prescriptions are filled, while 4 states have what's called a conscience clause, allowing pharmacists to refuse to fill a prescription if it violates their own morals. 9 others are considering similar laws. For Lloyd Duplantis, it's a matter of morality.
So we have a woman who's taken something to poison her system in order to stop her from ovulating, and I'm not going to participate in that.
But more than 11 million women do use oral contraception legally. And polls show the vast majority of Americans support their right to use the pill. Back in Georgia,
If you don't want to dispense all legal medication, then find yourself a new line of work.
a conflict between conscience and choice. Tom Costello, NBC News, Washington.
One of the iconic women of the American screen is dead tonight. Anne Bancroft was 73 and had suffered from cancer. She was born Anna Maria Italiano in the Bronx, New York in 1931. She made it to Hollywood, made a series of B movies, then found her way back to New York and Broadway, where she won 2 Tony Awards. In 1964, she married comedian, director, producer Mel Brooks. She appeared in 3 of his movies. Though she won an Oscar for her portrayal of Helen Keller's teacher in the film The Miracle Worker, she will, of course, be remembered for her portrayal of the middle-aged seductress Mrs. Robinson in The Graduate.
Can I ask you a personal question?
Ask me anything you want.
Is this your first time?
Is this what?
It is, isn't it? It is your first time.
That's a laugh, Mrs. Robinson. That's really a laugh.
Well, you can admit that, can't you?
Are you kidding?
It's nothing to be ashamed of.
Wait a minute.
Anne Bancroft always said she was surprised that that role of Mrs. Robinson got more attention than any other in her long career. She said she thought it was because the role gave voice to the fear that, quote, we reach a certain point in our lives and realize we're ordinary. Anne Bancroft was never ordinary. We're back with more right after this.
The Nightly Journal, brought to you by Walmart. Always low prices. Always.
When someone mentioned kindergarten in our newsroom today, it conjured up memories of nap time, graham crackers, and milk, which it turns out is proof of our age. Kindergarten has changed for a whole lot of 5-year-olds. It's not what it used to be, and of course, few things are. Our Nightly Journal tonight from NBC's Martin Savage.
You have an assignment on your desk.
For Raven Faulkner, it's another typical day of writing,
I'm going to give you a quit sound.
spelling,
Quit.
reading,
Between my toes, down my back,
Kindergarten.
on my nose.
coloring. Naps and snacks are still around, but these days,
I can do math.
it's curriculum, not cookies, that count. In addition to the 3 R's, 5-year-olds in some schools are learning science, social studies, even map reading.
What children know when they enter kindergarten about things like letters of the alphabet can predict reading scores all the way through 10th grade.
I read level 1, level 2, and level 3.
Part of the academic push comes from parents.
We wanted to know that a curriculum would help advance her. She won't be left behind.
The government's also helping to raise the bar with the No Child Left Behind Act. Under it, schools could face sanctions if they miss academic targets. But critics contend it's too much, too soon, turning kindergarten into kinder grind.
I feel we are robbing them of their childhood.
Earlier this year, kindergarten teachers in San Diego won a battle to reduce their school system's reading benchmark after it had been sharply raised.
It was very frustrating for the children. And also it was very frustrating for the parents because they felt like their children weren't achieving.
researcher David Elkine says fun time is educational too.
Play is a very important part of kindergarten education. Play is a way in which children learn, and children learn a lot of social skills through those things.
Experts say today's kindergarten needs to strike a balance of fun and study. What do kids think?
I don't think I can answer that right now.
But it won't be long until he has all the answers. Since, as every parent knows, the days of childhood are numbered. Martin Savage, NBC News, Atlanta.
Finally here, former President Jerry Ford has been out of the limelight lately. He didn't, for example, travel to the funeral of President Ronald Reagan a year ago, and that fed rumors about his health. But last night in California, cameras were there for an event with Vice President Dick Cheney, a former aide, after all, to Jerry Ford. The occasion was the presentation of a medal to former First Lady Betty Ford, who's an American hero in her own right for her work toward destigmatizing breast cancer and substance abuse. Mrs. Ford was receiving, of all things, the Gerald R. Ford Award for Public Service. While the president uses a cane to get around these days, perhaps because of the pounding his body took during his days as an All-American college football player, Gerald Ford is now 91, Betty Ford is 87, and they both look just great. That is Nightly News for this Tuesday night. Thank you for being with us. I'm Brian Williams. We'll look for you right back here tomorrow evening. Good night.